Welcome back. Now we go from non-democracies to democracies. So democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning common people, and kratia, meaning rule or power. So what we're saying is power to the people. So the second picture that you see down here is actually Amandla Wetu in South Africa. That means power to the people in the uprisings that led to the fall of apartheid. Of course, the Greek model up on the top is a fairly poor model. The Greeks had direct democracy, but no women or slaves could actually get involved. It was basically the same with the Romans. It was for the upper classes only. Implementation of a democracy varies. We've got direct democracy, very rare, but people actually vote on issues across the board. We have elements of that here. The Swiss are the champions of that method. We've got indirect democracy, which is the norm, where people vote for someone to represent them, and then they vote for you on specific issues. But in all democracies, there is a stress on participation in terms of voting in elections in particular, on competition in terms of between parties so that you've got a real choice, and on liberty. So we've got various freedoms like speech, movement, assembly, etc. Liberal democracy is the very kind that promotes participation, competition, and liberty. They're not necessarily liberal, i.e. hands-off, with respect to economics. So we're not talking about that sort of liberalism. Social democracies in Scandinavia, for example, which favor collective welfare over individual rights to a certain degree, would be a case in point, highly democratic states. So the central themes within democracy are that the people participate in elections, that there is public accountability of elected officials, and that there are legal limits placed on the government's authority, and finally that certain rights and freedoms are guaranteed, usually within a constitution or a set of laws in the British case. So we'll start by talking about civil rights versus civil liberties. Understandings of these really help determine what sort of government structure we're talking about. So civil rights refer to the promotion of equality for all the residents or citizens in a state. Civil liberties are about the promotion of freedom. Some states focus more on political rights or more on political liberties. So the civil liberties, a great case of a country that focuses more on civil liberties would be the United States. Scandinavia would be a set of countries that deal more with civil rights, the promotion of equality, okay? The right to work, the right to housing. These are more about civil rights than civil liberties. Our own civil rights movement was giving everyone equal access to opportunities, to facilities, to institutions. So that's one way of remembering what that is. Different states balance rights and liberties differently. Some believe that freedom of speech should occur at all costs. Others believe that you have to limit it, where it could incline people towards hatred and violence. So in the name of protecting everyone equally. A great case of this, the second point on the slide here, is Holocaust denial. It is illegal to deny the Holocaust in a range of European countries: Austria, Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia. And this has been a source of very interesting clashes in the European Union. Great Britain, which is much more pro-liberties than pro-rights, thwarted a 2005 EU effort to criminalize Holocaust denial across the entire political system. In other words, all the EU countries. Germany, interestingly, is the one that introduced this again in 2007, a year after a British historian was jailed in Austria for his denial. So, this is an interesting case, but we'll talk a little bit about the rationale here. So certain anti-democratic groups and parties have been banned in Europe, where they focus more on civil rights than on civil liberties. On our side, an interesting case is the Westboro Baptist Church of Topeka, Kansas. They've led somewhere between 20 and 25,000 demonstrations of radical homophobia, especially at gay funerals and weddings. They're also anti-Semitic, they're anti-Catholic, they're anti-Protestant, they're racist. There aren't a lot of people these people like. Here's a quote from their website. The WBC engages in daily peaceful sidewalk demonstrations opposing the homosexual lifestyle of soul-damning, nation-destroying filth. We display large, colorful signs containing Bible words and sentiments, including God hates fags, fags hate God, AIDS cures fags, thank God for AIDS, Fags burn in hell. God is not mocked. Fags are nature freaks. God gave fags up, etc., etc. Oh, there's America is doomed. The world is doomed. God blew up the troops. They're not crazy about American troops because they allow for homosexuals in their ranks. So this gives you an idea of what sort of organization we're talking about. Now, this is clearly the sort of organization that in a state that favored civil rights over civil liberties would not exist illegally. Okay, so in Europe, much of Europe, this sort of organization would be banned in order to prevent violence. They would say hatred. In America, we take a different tack, and here, coming from the ACLU, which certainly does not support any of the things that the Westboro Baptist Church does, but what they say is that we need to protect free speech. In response to an attempt by New Jersey legislators to restrict free speech, in this case, to limit the rights of Westboro Baptist Church activists to hold their demonstrations, the ACLU reacted with this quote, "Our legislators' desire to silence the WBC is understandable, but it also reflects an unwarranted disregard for freedom of speech and a loss of faith in the marketplace of ideas." And this is key, the marketplace of ideas in countries that value civil liberties. Back to the quote. "We are not a nation that pushes bad ideas underground. We are a people who believe in allowing ideas, even odious, hurtful ones, to get out. And we do not hesitate to give a good public tongue lashing to ideas that deserve it." Okay? So this is the idea that non-bigots will essentially counter the bigots and make the system work. This shows how it's supposed to play out. So the bigots, we've got the KKK marching. And if any of you have ever seen a KKK march, what you find is that the non-bigots, the counter marchers, usually outnumber them by large margins. Incidentally, the KKK actually recently protested against Westboro guys in June of 2011. I thought that was interesting. But all of this brings up the question of what's the best balance. Excuse me, civil rights and civil liberties, trying to balance these. It's matched with the question of what's the best system. You know, what's the best in terms of the democratic system in particular. The oldest is indirect democracy, republicanism. The focus is on separating powers and having people represented through elected officials. So modern democracy is representative. It's indirect with the exception of Switzerland in particular and other countries that occasionally allow for direct democracy in certain cases. We could trace modern democracy back to England, which is incidentally the land with no constitution. Nobles forced King John way back in the 13th century to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. What this did is it limited the rights of the king, who was forced to consult with barons, these nobles, on particular issues, especially taxes. It created a proto-legislature. It guaranteed all aristocrats had due process and thus some civil rights. For example, they could complain and not be imprisoned. So what this meant is the king bound himself and his, quote, heirs forever to grant, quote, to all free men of our kingdom the rights and liberties that were described here. The king was no longer above the law. This is a first, where the monarch limits himself. It didn't end the monarch's dreams, but it created new expectations from the people writ large, more and more of whom gradually were included in the definition of freemen as the British case evolved, which we'll talk about more in a couple of weeks. And we had violent resistance when the king tried to overstep his bounds. English settlers to America actually brought copies of the Magna Carta and much later used this document in their fight. Okay, so parts of our Constitution are straight out of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, what it did is it provided for rule of law. Individuals are subject to the same system, regardless of power, regardless of position. Now, the Magna Carta was really about aristocrats, largely. But over time, the notions of participation in democracies have expanded. Today, there are lots of ways that you can participate. You can lobby. Interest groups lobby all the time. You can write letters to your congressional officials, to the executive branch. We can hold protests, demonstrations, rallies. The most obvious one is voting, which is designed to limit the abuse of power and increase representation. You don't like them, vote them out. Hold them accountable. It's about accountability. Suffrage is the right to vote for adults, which has been slow in coming. New Zealand was the first to give women the right to vote. The U.S. gave them the right to vote in 1920. France allowed women to vote in 1944, towards the end of the war. Other categories, we've had discriminatory literacy tests in the U.S. through the 1960s that were efforts to curb the participation of African Americans. In some cases, you actually have mandatory voting. Some states like Australia, Belgium, Britain will actually fine you for not voting. So there are different approaches to this participation. Make it mandatory, make it voluntary, whom to allow to participate. Electoral systems are designed to balance the need for participation and effective governance. These are the rules that decide how votes are cast, how they're counted, how they're translated into legislative or executive seats. Okay, if we're talking about a presidential system. And again, what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it so that you've got an adequate representation, but not so much representation that it allows for such a diversity of views that you can't actually govern. And we'll come to that in a couple minutes. There are two main forms of electoral systems: single-member districts and proportional representation. There are also various mixes, which we'll talk about when we look at some specific countries. The plurality SMD system is the first-past-the-post, winner-takes-all system. It's the one where once you, the running candidate, get a plurality more than any other candidate, then you win. So if there are only two candidates and you get 50% plus one, then you win. There is, in this system, one representative per constituency. So you can take a circle and divide it up into a bunch of pieces, and each one of those would be a constituency, a district, and there's only one representative that comes out from this. So going back to our example, if this candidate beats the other candidate, well, what that means is that all the other votes are wasted. Okay, so if someone gets 51% and the other guy gets 49%, well, the person who got 51%, first past the post, the winner is going to win. And the guy who got 49% is going to lose. And that means that all those votes are people who are not going to be, as in their eyes, adequately represented. Okay, this is a fairly rare system. We have it in the U.S., we have it in the UK, in Canada, India, Nigeria, not so many countries. So there are some major disadvantages of this system. In terms of representation, you can have similar percentage of the votes for different parties, but one can win many more seats if they win more districts. For example, you can have national elections in 30 districts. Let's say there are 30 districts in a state. And by state, I mean a country. So in this state, you have 30 districts. In each one, the big party, let's just call it big party, big B, big P, gets 51% of the seats, and the sad party, big S, big P, gets 49% of the seats. Ultimately, the sad party has no representatives. The big party has them all. Okay, so for representation, you're literally, in a sense, disenfranchising nearly half the country. Another problem with this system is that it tends to be more risk averse. There's a disincentive for greater pluralism. For example, new parties. People are unwilling to vote for unknowns from small parties because that's throwing their vote away. Okay, how many people vote for the green candidate in our country? Okay, so the SMD system is more likely to be a two-party dominated legislature. You go for someone who has a chance. Same thing with the presidential elections. So Ross Perot scored big in 1992, and I can't remember. I should have this, but I think it was around 20% or so. But that was a miracle. Most people didn't want to, and have not before, and did not after, want to waste their votes on a third-party candidate because they thought this person has very little chance. So how does the majority-based system, how does this SMD system remedy this? Well, you've got a majority-based SMD system. In this system, you've got two rounds. The winner has to have a majority, more than 50%, not just a plurality. And they can get this in the first round, but it's much less likely. So more people are going to take a chance on the first round on a small party candidate, with the assumption that probably no one's going to get more than 50% in the first round anyway. And then during the second round, which is a runoff round, you can vote for the least of two evils, or whoever you want who made it into the second round. You can also have voters rank order their candidates. Those candidates with the fewest first preferences are sequentially eliminated until finally one has the majority. The problem is that with a majority-based SMD system, you're still talking about lots of votes that are ultimately wasted, and a couple parties tend to dominate. So we can compare the electoral systems. A majority SMD system is better for representation than a plurality SMD system. Okay, but a plurality system is better for moderation. Okay? There's something known as the median voter theorem, that extremists are weeded out because people are afraid of wasting their vote. We might support extremists, but we think, oh, hardly anyone's going to vote this extremist candidate into power, and so, well, let's just vote for the next best option, which is a mainstream candidate. So this is a median voter theorem. Candidates are more likely to go mainstream. You're less likely to have extremist candidates because people are going to be afraid to waste their votes on you. So where a majority SMD system loses, and the picture you see here is that of Le Pen's 2002 candidacy. So France's election back in 2002. You always have some extremists in on elections. They usually have no chance. In a plurality SMD system, as I just said, it's hard for them to get any votes because people are afraid of wasting their votes. In France and many others, where you've got a majority-based SMD system, not plurality-based, this becomes immaterial. And so here along comes Jean-Marie Le Pen, a right-wing head of the National Front, who had, among other things, advocated for the forced isolation from society of all people infected with HIV, accused various French leaders of being puppets of Jewish interests, lamented the French World Cup team for not being white enough, not an accurate reflection of French society, campaigned on xenophobia and an anti-Muslim message. Now, there were lots of contenders for the French presidency, but the biggest ones were the incumbent, who was at that time Prime Minister Lionel Jospin, and Jacques Chirac. The incumbent Prime Minister, I shouldn't say, not the incumbent president, of course. Trailing after that was this leader of the National Front, Jean-Marie Le Pen. Now, the results of the first round, Jospin and Chirac split a bulk of the vote among the mainstream voters. They took that mainstream and they split it. Meanwhile, Le Pen consolidated his right-wing votes. So what happened is Jacques Chirac got 19.9%, Jospin got 16.2%, and Le Pen got 16.9%. Okay, so because Jospin and Chirac split the mainstream vote, this extremist, with only 16.9% of the vote, managed to get into the second round. This led to a huge rally by the anti-right wing, including enormous protests and political consolidation of the mainstream. And in the second round of the elections, Chirac got 82% of the vote, and Le Pen got just 17.8% of the vote. But remember, Le Pen would have never gotten where he did without this two-round majority SMD system. And this had major implications for the internal and external image of France, and it caused a lot of soul-searching. The SMD majority system is also done in parliamentary and other elections. One person ultimately gets all the votes, but there's more room for others to contend. So before we go on, I will change it because I've been talking for a long time. So on to PR in just a moment.